Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And the subtitle is called A Second Look at the Federal Reserve. And this is the fifth edition that we're reading. If you have a book, if you have your own copy, you can follow with us there. If not, you can more than welcome to follow with us here on camera. So before we start, I just want to say real quick that this book was inspired by fundamentals. I think it's important to understand how the financial system works because we're so ingrained in it and embedded in it in our daily life. And I don't think that finance is something that people have a lot of education on or knowledge about. So, and I think this book is important too because I think of it like a classic. It should be taught in all the uh probably elementary school. You want to start early. Start early with your kids on how money works, on what money is, on the history of money, and not only money, but what currency is, what different types of currency, investments, things like that. This is all very important in a way to survive in this world. So that's the inspiration for reading this book. And okay, so in if you're finding this helpful, you can check out our other books. I'm just going to do a little quick plug before we start reading here. On Mondays, we have our spiritual book club where we read spiritual books. And then Wednesdays, we have our health book club where we read books on health, how to stay healthy, how to eat healthy, etc., etc., etc. So you can check us out there. I have all that information in our newsletters. We have a monthly newsletter that we put out. So you can go to our website, sign up for our newsletter, keep in touch with what we're doing. So we're always trying to think of something new to do. Keep it interesting, eh? And all our books that we've read, as well as the current books that we're reading, we put them on YouTube. So you can subscribe to our YouTube, share and like, so we can help grow our community. Reading is a lost art, and I think it's important to go back to reading. If you look at successful people, rich people, I don't know, maybe happy people, they're voracious readers. Voracious readers. They got massive library and they just like to read. So anyways, I wanted to inspire that in our community. If you have a book that you want us to read, you can recommend that. I'll leave a link in the description box below. Whether it's a spiritual book, a health book, financial book, we'd love to consider it and we'd love to read it. And then lastly, if you find this valuable, if you find value in what we're doing, you can support us by buy me a coffee or check out our merch. We have new designs coming out, especially for the holidays. So you can check it out on our website. Um, and we have podcasts that we put out once in a while where I interview interesting people, and there is a designated tab for that on our website as well. So you could check those out. And finally, if you're in the LA area or traveling to the Los Angeles area on vacation or business or whatever, come check us out in person. We'd love to meet you in person and meet you face to face. We have a healing center that we use technologies that's based on Nikola Tesla's scalar wave energy research for holistic healings for both domestic cats and dogs as well as humans. And we have information about that on our website as well. So you can check those out and our other services as well. So, having said that, let us continue our reading. And I just wanted to give a shout out to all of you who have um, stuck with us so far. This is a massive book, and we are almost to the tail end. I think we have about 3 months left. or 2 months left, or 3 months left, whatever, before we finish this book. So kudos to you for sticking it out. And I sure hope you're enjoying it. Yeah, I know I have tremendous respect for this particular book and the research that has gone into it. So thank you, Mr. Griffin. And he's still alive, by the way. I think he's in his 90s, and this is 2025. So good for him. I hope he lives long. They say that our body can live to be at least 150. Hopefully, one day we will see 150 is like the new 40, right? Whatever they call it. Okay, so let's start. Oops, sorry about that. I'm just going to move the camera in a little bit. Let's see if that's good enough. Maybe that's a little too much. And please share your comments below. We'd love to hear from you, see what you think. Um, Join our community. So, anyways, okay, so this is chapter 22, and this is part 2. And here we go. All right, the Glass-Owen bill emerges. In his committee House report in 1913, Glass objected to the Aldrich bill on the following grounds. It lacked government control, he said. It concentrated power into the hands of the larger New York banks. It, it opened the door to inflation. It was dishonest in its estimate of cost to the taxpayer. And it established a banking cartel. Oh, sorry, banking monopoly. All of which was correct. What the country needed, Glass said, was an entirely fresh approach, a genuine reform bill which was not written by agents of the money trust and which would truly meet the needs of the common man. That too was quite correct. Then he brought forth his own bill, drafted by Willis and inspired by Laughlin, which in every important detail was merely the old corpse of the Aldrich bill pulled from its casket, freshly perfumed and dressed in a new suit. The Glass bill was soon reconciled with a similar measure sponsored by Senator Robert L. Owen, and it emerged as the Glass-Owen bill. Although there were initially some minor differences between Glass and Owen on the proper degree of government control over banking, Owen was basically of identical mind to Willis and Laughlin. While serving in the Senate, he also was the president of a bank in Oklahoma. Like Aldrich, he had made several trips to Europe to study the central banks of England and Germany, and these were the models for his legislation. The less technically minded members of the cartel became nervous over the anti-Wall Street rhetoric of the bill's sponsors. Wahlberg, in an attempt to quell their fears and at the same time strengthen his private boast that he had been the real author, published a side-by-side comparison of the Aldrich and Glass proposals. The analysis showed that not only were the two bills in agreement on all essential provisions, but they even contained entire sections that were identical in their wording. And that was from Wahlberg, Volume 1, page 98. He wrote, quote, brushing aside then the external differences affecting the shells, we find the kernels of the two systems very closely resembling and related to one another. And that quote was from IBIT, page 412. It was important for the success of the Glass bill to create the impression it was in response to the views of the broad cross-section of the financial community. To this end, Glass and his committee staged public hearings for the announced purpose of giving everyone a chance for input to the process. It was, of course, a sham. The first draft of the bill had already been completed in secret several months before the hearings were held. And, as was customary in such matters, Congressman Lindbergh and other witnesses opposing the Jekyll Island plan were not allowed to speak. And that quote, that footnote was from Lindbergh, page 129. The hearings were widely reported in the press, and the public was given the impression that the favorable testimony was truly representative of expert opinion. Coco summarizes, quote, although they were careful to keep the contents of their work confidential, to aid the passage of any bill that might be agreed upon, Glass deemed it desirable to hold public meetings on the topic and to make sure the course of these hearings was not left to chance. The public assumption of the hearing was that no bills had been drafted, and Willis's draft was never mentioned, much less revealed. The hearings of Glass Subcommittee in January and February 1913 were nothing less than a love feast. And that quote was from Coco Triumph, page 225. Bankers become divided. The public was not the only victim of deception. The bankers themselves were also targeted, at least the lesser ones who were not part of the Wall Street power center. As early as February 1911, a group of 22 of the country's most powerful bankers met for 3 days behind closed doors in Atlantic City to work out a strategy for getting the smaller banks to support the concept of using the government to authorize and maintain their own cartel. The objective, frankly discussed among those present, was that the proposed cartel would bring the smaller banks under control of the larger ones, but that this fact had to be obscured when presenting it to them for endorsement. And that footnote was from Rothbard, Crisis, page 101, also Coco, Triumph, page 186. The annual meeting of the American Bankers Association was held a few months later, and a resolution endorsing the Aldrich Bill was steamrollered through the plenary session, much to the dismay of many of those present. Andrew Frame was one of them. Representing a group of Western bankers, he testified at the hearings of the Glass Subcommittee mentioned previously and described the hoax. When that monetary bill was given to the country, it was but a few days previous to the meeting of the American Bankers Association in New Orleans in 1911. There was not one banker in 100 who had read that bill. We had 12 addresses in favor of it. General Hamby of Austin, Texas, wrote a letter to President Watts asking for a hearing against the bill. He did not get a very courteous answer. I refused to vote on it, and a great many other bankers did likewise. They would not allow anyone on the program who was not in favor of the bill. And that quote, end quote, and that quote was quoted by Mullins, page 13. It is interesting that during Frame's testimony, Congressman Glass refrained from commenting on the unfairness of allowing only one side of an issue to be heard in a public forum. He could hardly afford to. That is exactly what he was then doing with his own agenda. As the Federal Reserve Act moved closer to its birth in the form of the Glass-Owen bill, Owen was the co-sponsor in the Senate. Both Aldrich and Vanderlip threw themselves into a great public dismay of opposition. No opportunity was overlooked to make a statement to the press or anyone else of public prominence, expressing their eternal animosity to this monstrous legislation. Vanderlip warned against the evils of fiat money and rampant inflation. Aldrich charged that the Glass-Owen bill was inimical to sound banking and good government. Vanderlip predicted speculation and instability in the stock market. Aldrich sourly complained that the bill was, quote, revolutionary in its character, end quote, implying Bolshevistic, and, quote, will be the first and most important step toward changing our form of government from a democracy to an autocracy, end quote. And that quote was from Aldrich to John A. Slater, sorry, butchered that name. July 16, 1913, Aldrich to William Howard Taft, October 3rd, 1913, and Nelson Aldrich Papers, Library of Congress. The pretense is dropped. That all of this was merely high-level showmanship was made clear when Vanderlip accepted a debate with Congressman Glass before the New York Economic Society in November 13. There were 1,100 bankers and businessmen present, and Vanderlip was under pressure to make a good showing before this impressive group. The debate was going badly for him, and in a moment of desperation, he finally dropped the pretense. Quote, for years, he said, bankers have been almost the sole advocates of just this sort of legislation that is now hoped we will have, and it is unfair to accuse them of being in opposition to sound legislation. And that quote was from Frank Vanderlip, Frank A. Vanderlip, address before the, or address before the Economics Club of New York, November 13, 1913. New York, 1913, page 611 FF. I don't know what that means. If someone knows, leave a comment in the comment below, please. FF. Okay, also see Glass, page 128, 125, 168 to 76. 22 years later, when the need for pretense had long passed, Vanderlip was even more candid. Writing in the Saturday Evening Post, he said, although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated before when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless, its essential points were all contained in the plan that finally was adopted. End quote. And that quote was from Farmer Boy to Financier by Frank A. Vanderlip, Saturday Evening Post, February 9, 1935, page 72. In his autobiography, Treasury Secretary William McAdoo offered this view. Quote, bankers fought the Federal Reserve legislation and every provision of the Federal Reserve Act with the tireless energy of men fighting a forest fire. They said it was populistic, socialistic, half-baked, destructive, infantile, badly conceived, and unworkable. These interviews with bankers led me to an interesting conclusion. I perceived gradually through all the haze and smoke of controversy that the banking world was not really as opposed to the bill as it pretended to be. And that quote was from McAdoo, page 213 and 225 to 226. Just a side note, it's interesting that the politicians and bankers and business people, they didn't really look back into history as to how the fiat money worked. I mean, there's already precedent in terms of how fiat worked. Um, and this is the third central bank that they're establishing. Just to know, that's just the thought that came to my mind. I don't know. Maybe if they would have studied their history, they would have, you know, not have a Federal Reserve or not vote on one, I guess. I don't know. Anyways, okay, that is onward. That is the key to this entire episode. Mass psychology, also known as PSYOP, psychological operation. Military talk, military speak, right? Since Aldrich was recognized as associated with the Morgan interests, and Vanderlip was president of Rockefeller's National City Bank, the public was skillfully led to believe that the quote money trust was mortally afraid of the proposed Federal Reserve Act. The Nation was the only prominent publication to point out that every one of the horrors described by Aldrich and Vanderlip could have been equally ascribed to the Aldrich bill as well. But this lone voice was easily drowned by the great cacophony of deception and propaganda. The Glass Bill was a flexible document which was designed from the beginning to be altered in non essential matters in order to appear as though compromises were being made to satisfy the various political factions. Since very few understood central bank technicalities, the ploy was easy to execute. The basic strategy was to focus debate on such relatively unimportant items as the number of regional banks, the structure of the governing board, and the process by which the board was to be selected. When truly crucial matters, when truly crucial matters could not be avoided, the response was to agree to almost anything but to write the provisions in vague language. In that way, the back door would be left ajar for later implementation of the original intent. The goal was to get the bill passed and perfected later. House and Warburg feared that if they waited until they had everything they wanted, they would get nothing at all, or worse, that opponents of a central bank would be able to muster their focus and pass a reform bill of their own, a real one. Willis was quick to agree. In a letter to his former professor, he wrote, quote, "It is much better to take a half a loaf rather than to be absolutely deprived of a chance of getting any bread whatsoever. The so-called progressive element, such as Lindbergh and his supporters, will be encouraged to enact dangerous legislation." End quote. And that quote was from, sorry about the back and forth, people. Letters from Willis to Laughlin, J. Lawrence Laughlin Papers, Library of Congress, July 14 and 18, 1912. Okay. Glass echoed the sentiment, directing his remarks at those smaller banks which were resisting domination by the New York banks. He said, quote, "Unless the conservative bankers of the country are willing to yield something and get behind the bill, we shall get legislation very much less to be desired, or have nothing done at all." End quote. And that quote was from a letter to Festus Wade, quoted by Coco, Triumph, page 234. Bryan makes an ultimatum. The populist William Jennings Bryan was considered at that time to be the most influential Democrat in Congress. And it was clear from the start that the Federal Reserve Act could never be passed without his approval and support. As Charles Seymour observed, quote, "The commoner's sense of loyalty to the party had kept him from an attack upon the Federal Reserve Act, which it would appear he never entirely understood. With his influence in the party, he could have destroyed the measure which failed to accord with his personal doctrines." End quote. And that quote was from Seymour, Volume 1, page 173. Bryan had said that he would not support any bill that resulted in private money being issued by private banks. The money supply, he insisted, must be government issue. When he finally saw an actual draft of the bill in midsummer in 1913, he was dismayed to find that not only was the money to be privately issued, but the entire governing body of the central bank was to be composed of private bankers. His ultimatum was not long in coming. His hotly demanded, number one, that the Federal Reserve notes must be treasury currency issued and guaranteed by the government, and number two, that the governing body must be appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. Colonel House and the other monetary scientists were reasonably sure that these provisions eventually would be required for final approval of the bill. But being master strategists, they deliberately withheld them from early drafts so they could be used as bargaining points and added later as concessions in a show of compromise. Furthermore, since practically no one really understood the technical aspects of the measure, they knew it would be easy to fool their opponents by creating the appearance of compromise when in actual operation, the originally intended features would remain. An amazing revelation. The nature of this deception was spelled out years later by Carter Glass in his book, Adventures in Constructive Finance. From this source, we learned that after Bryan had delivered his ultimatum, Glass was summoned to the White House and told by Wilson that the decision had been made to make the Federal Reserve notes obligations of the United States government. Quote, I was for an instant speechless, wrote Glass, who then explained how he reminded the president that the only backing for a new currency would be a small amount of gold, a large amount of government and commercial debt, and the private assets of the individual banks themselves. Quote, it would be a pretense on its face, he said. Was there ever a government note based primarily on the property of banking institutions? Was there ever a government issue, not $1 of which could be put out except by demand of a bank? The suggested government obligation is so remote, it would never be discovered. End quote. To which the president replied, exactly so, Glass. Every word you say is true. The government liability is a mere thought. And so, if we can hold the substance of the thing and give the other fellow the shadow, why not do it if thereby we may save our bill? End quote. And that, I guess that conversation was from Glass, page 124 and 1 to 125. Years later, Paul Warburg would explain further. While technically and legally the Federal Reserve note is an obligation of the United States government, in reality it is an obligation, the sole actual responsibility of which rests on the reserve banks. The government could only be called upon to take them up after the reserve banks had failed. And that quote was from Warburg, Volume 1, page 409. Wahlberg's explanation should be carefully analyzed. It is an incredibly important statement. The man who masterminded the Federal Reserve System is telling us that the Federal Reserve notes constitute privately issued money with the taxpayer standing by to cover the potential losses of those banks which issue it. So that means if the banks cannot foot the bill, then the American people will. And what makes the bank think, oh, well, I am not really obligated since I have the insurance, right, of the American people. I'm kind of putting in my understanding little 2 cents here for those of you who are just listening. What would stop the bank from thinking, oh, okay, I have the American taxpayers as my insurance. Why don't I just not pay and let the American taxpayers pay and forego my obligation to pay? Shifting the responsibility to something else, right? And that's kind of how our world is run. You're always shifting the responsibility to somebody else. Like it's somebody else's fault. They would clean up your mess kind of thing, especially with insurances. So I don't know. Just a thought, a little side note. Sorry, I got a little squirrel there. Okay. So let me read that sentence again because it is in italics, and according to the author, it's very important. So I'm going to read that again. The man who masterminded the Federal Reserve System is telling us that the Federal Reserve notes constitute privately issued money with the taxpayers standing by to cover the potential losses of those banks which issue it. One of the more controversial assertions of this book is that the objectives set forth at the Jekyll Island meeting included the shifting of the cartel's losses from the owners of the banks to the taxpayers. Warburg himself has confirmed it. But let us return to the Great Deceit of 1913. The second demand made by Bryan, political control over the system, not banker control, was met with an equally beguiling compromise. In addition to the governing board of regional bankers previously proposed, there now would be a central regulatory commission to be called the Federal Reserve Board, appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. And there's a footnote on that. It says the original plan called for the Secretary of the Treasury and the Comptroller of the Currency to be on the board also, but this was later dropped. Hmm. Thus, the public was to be protected through a sharing of power, a melding of interests, a system of checks and balances. In this way, said Wilson, quote, the banks may be instruments, not the masters, of business and of individual enterprise and initiative, end quote. And that quote was quoted by Grider, sorry, butchered that name, page 277. The arrangement was heralded as a bold new experiment in representative government. In reality, it was but the return of the ancient partnership between the monetary and political scientists. The only thing new was that power was now to be shared openly in plain view of the public. But of course, there would not be much to see. All the deliberations and most of the decisions were to happen behind closed doors. Furthermore, the division of power and responsibility between these groups was left deliberately vague. Without a detailed line of command or even a clear concept of function, it was inevitable that, as with the drafting of the bill itself, real power would gravitate into the hands of those with technical knowledge and Wall Street connections. To the monetary scientists drafting the bill and engineering the compromises, the eventual concentration of effective control into their hands was never in serious doubt. And as we shall see in the next chapter, subsequent events have proved the soundness of that strategy. Bryan endorses the bill. Bryan was no match for the Jekyll Island strategists, and he accepted the quote compromises at face value. Had there been any lingering doubts in his mind, they were swept away by gratitude for his appointment as Wilson's Secretary of State. Now that he was on the team, he declared, quote, I appreciate so profoundly the service rendered by the president to the people in the stand he has taken on the fundamental principles involved in currency reform, that I am with him in all the details. The right of the government to issue money is not surrendered to the banks. The control over the money so issued is not relinquished by the government. I am glad to endorse earnestly and unreservedly the currency bill as a much better measure than I supposed it possible to secure at this time. Conflicting opinions have been reconciled with a success hardly to have been expected. End quote. And that quote was from Glass, page 139 to 142. With the conversion of Bryan, there was no longer any doubt about the final outcome. The Federal Reserve Act was released from the joint House and Senate Conference Committee on December 22nd, 1913, just as Congress was preoccupied with departure for the Christmas recess and in no mood for debate. It quickly passed by a vote of 282 to 60 in the House and 43 to 23 in the Senate. The president signed it into law the next day. The creature had swallowed Congress. Summary. Oh, just a side note, I love the metaphor. I love how the author uses these metaphors to kind of drive the point home, right? Anyways, okay, summary. President Taft, although a Republican spokesman for big businesses, refused to champion the Aldrich bill for a central bank. This marked him for political extinction. The money trust wanted a president who would aggressively promote the bill, and the man selected was Woodrow Wilson, who had already publicly declared his allegiance. Wilson's nomination at the Democratic National Convention was secured by Colonel House, a close associate of Morgan and Walberg. To make sure that Taft did not win his bid for re-election, The money trust encouraged the former Republican President Teddy Roosevelt to run on the progressive ticket. The result, as planned, was that Roosevelt pulled away Republican support from Taft, and Wilson won the election with less than a majority vote. Wilson and Roosevelt campaigned vigorously against the evils of the money trust, while all along being dependent upon that same trust for campaign funding. When Wilson was elected, Colonel House literally moved into the White House and became the unseen president of the United States. Under his guidance, the Aldrich Bill was given cosmetic surgery and emerged as the Glass-Owen Bill. Although sponsored by Democrats in all essential features, it was still the Jekyll Island plan. Aldrich, Vanderlip, and others identified with Wall Street put on a pretense of opposing the Glass-Owen Bill to convince Congress and the public that big bankers were fearful of it. The final bill was written with many sound features which were included to make it palatable during congressional debate, but which were pre-designed to be dropped in later years. To win the support of the populists under the leadership of William Jennings Bryan, the Jekyll Island team also engineered what appeared to be compromises, but which in actual opposition were, as Wilson called them, mere shadows, while the substance remained. In short, Congress was outflanked, outfoxed, and outclassed by a deceptive but brilliant psychopolitical attack. The result is that on December 23rd, 1913, America once again had a central bank. So Congress and the American people were hookwinked. Wow, interesting. All the political games they play, that's very, very deceiving. Anyways, that's the end of chapter 22. And I hope you enjoyed that chapter. We will continue our reading next time with a new chapter. So in the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day, great evening, great afternoon, wherever you are. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye now.